Welcome to this webinar, the second in a series that ORF is conducting in association with our foundation, Her Afghanistan Foundation. And this is the second one in which we are going to discuss the current role of great powers in Afghanistan. As we are all aware, Afghanistan has been an area of the great game, as Ivan would like to call it, according to his journal, for many centuries. And of late, of course, particularly post World War, the Second World War, it has been an area of particular contestation between Russia and the United States. Therefore, this webinar is an attempt to try and understand what is the role that these great powers can play in the region, and also to try and understand from a perspective of the Afghans themselves as to A, do they welcome this role at all, any kind of great powers in their region? And if they do, or if they expect something from the great powers, what are these expectations? And since, of course, India is involved, ORF is involved in this webinar, we will also have uh, our representative from India tell us about the Indian perspective on what the situation in Afghanistan is. Let me start with a couple of housekeeping announcements. One is to all of those who have joined us that they will have to ask their questions in the chat box. Firstly, welcome to everyone. And I will read out those questions to our panelists as and when the time for the Q&A comes up. The second is that we are not going to conduct this particular webinar in the usual format where you have the panelists make opening statements and then move on to a question answer session. What we're going to try and do is to make this a little livelier, is to try and start with me asking the panelists directly a couple of questions and then move on to questions from the participants. So as not to waste any time and give us more time, give the panelists more time to respond, let me start with directing my first question to Mariam Wardak, who all of you know is, well, I would say that she's an expert on Afghanistan, definitely, has been involved in policy making there, as well as now runs her Afghanistan Foundation and is widely published, particularly in India. Mariam, the question I have is, uh, we've seen a certain period of time, there was much expectation from the talks that were opened between the Taliban and the US first, then the other powers, then the intra Afghan dialogue. But in recent times, we've suddenly seen, particularly in the times now, we've suddenly seen a spate of increase in violence. And what is striking is that there have been certain events where even the Taliban has sort of expressed itself against the violence. So, what is it that is happening in Afghanistan? What kind of new politics is being injected into the area right now? And what role does the involvement of great powers play in this?
Thank you, Nandan. We have to look at Afghanistan in a holistic picture in the sense that Afghanistan was not only fighting the Afghan Taliban, but Afghanistan, the Afghan National Defense Security Forces were fighting regional and international terrorist groups, and now there's a spike in criminal activity due to the lack of job opportunities in Afghanistan. So I think the patience of the Afghan people have been very stretched very thin. There was a beam of light of hope when the Afghan Taliban have decided to come and speak to the Afghan government, with, of course, the influence of all of the international community.
Mariam, they want you to be a little louder. You're
Oh,
not very audible.
could you hear me now? Okay, great. I was saying that the Afghan National Defense Security Forces were fighting on multiple levels. And the Afghan people's patience were very thin in the sense that there were no job opportunities and there was criminal activity that was on the rise. We have to look at all these components in this aspect that the Afghan people are just exhausted in the sense that they don't find that anyone has, none of the international community or at times the Afghan government has their best interest at heart. You see many Afghan activists now making statements like Farishta Karim, who started this bus, saying that I think that the intra-Afghan negotiation team should go to each province and talk to the Afghan people, the Afghan women, the Afghan kids on what they're looking for the way forward in regards to peace. But the intra-Afghan negotiation team was selected by the Afghan government, and the Afghan government is selected by the Afghan people. So there is a disconnect. What is really happening? Is the intra-Afghan negotiation team only a political team that's representing a certain fraction of individuals? Are they ready to have theological arguments with the Afghan Taliban on what is going to be the best way forward for the Afghan people? The spike in violence that we see, it is not only a contribution to the Afghan Taliban. You have many spoilers here. You have many people who don't want the peace process to move forward. So there's going to be many incidents. Just recently, we had a young human rights activist who worked at the Human Rights Commission, Natasha Khalil, I believe is her name, Fatima Natasha Khalil, was killed through an IED, and nobody took claim. So the question is, who are these individuals who want to spoil it? I know ISIS is one of the large organizations. We hear chatter and batter here about Al Qaeda wanting to spoil the process. And just recent revelations in the New York Times about how other nations are using that were using the Afghan militants as a force to fight to use the Afghan grounds as their own political play. So the question that we constantly ask is, oh, what do the Afghan people want? The Afghan people are just exhausted of being the playground of everybody else's war, and they would like a future for themselves. Now we have to look 40 years of war. The intellectual community was asked to leave when the Soviets invaded. So we had shopkeepers and we had the lower stance stay to fight. They joined the Mujahideen, they fought. Many of them died. Their children were raised in the civil war. Then we had the war against terrorism. So all the Afghan people until just recently knew was violence. Now that they had a taste of education, a taste of economic independence, a taste of freedom, they opened their eyes to travel and see what civilized nations are. I think they want to stop. They want to put an end to violence, and how they want to put an end to violence is just to end violence, and what happens later would be the next step. But how could you end violence when you have multiple terrorist groups in your country active, and when you have no economic support to provide any alternative to the youth?
Mariam, thank you for that. But that obviously leads me to the second question, and maybe that is a much more complicated, maybe it's naive. You just spoke about the youth, particularly the youth who have had exposure to education, who want a better life, who obviously have a understanding of what they consider to be a better life, and who want an end to violence. That is understandable. But you also have a sharp divide on how Afghanistan should be governed. What are the rules that should govern? I mean, you have, of course, at one level, an extreme religious view, and probably at the other side, you have an extremely liberal view. So, where is the marriage between these two likely to sort of find a compromise?
Afghanistan is a very traditional conservative society. Unfortunately, the public believes that Kabul is Afghanistan, Afghanistan is Kabul. Kabul is very influenced by the international community that they're in. But when you step 5 miles outside of Kabul, it's a very traditional lifestyle. And I don't agree with having an Islamic Emirate stand. But I believe that there could be a medium between the two. How it's going to approach, I mean, I've had many young people make the arguments that if the Taliban find that they have really strong followers, then they should stand for the election and motivate their own people to vote for them. That's a great stand. But remember, when Mullah Omar first emerged, his whole point was to start an emirates because he wanted to bring the king, Zahir Shah, back. He wanted to bring a monarchy back. But however, when he came to Kabul and he started to realize the divide and the international influence, a year after the Taliban arose, they decided to leave the king's family out and they decided to rule. And they believed the best way to rule was through the code of Islam. Why? Because there was so much vengeance, so much hate, so much violence going. They felt that the only rule book that they could follow was the Quran. Now, could there be a medium? Again, we do have a large population of youth, but not a large percentage of them are educated. The only educated are the ones that are mostly in Kabul. So the percentage of it is small. Now, when we go to outside of Kabul, it's a very tribal system. It's tribal elders, which is why Taliban had a very strong hold in the provinces, because the tribal system works outside of Kabul. Again, you're looking at a country that most of the country, about 65% only has electricity. So how can you communicate directly to your citizens? The best way forward is the intra-Afghan negotiation dialogue with the Afghan Taliban. However, they need to have members such as Fatima Gilani and hopefully a few others to properly educate themselves on how to make theological arguments with the Afghan Taliban to take for the best interest of the Afghan people. So they need to review their hadiths. They need to reflect on Islamic verses, on human rights. And we have to keep in mind that women's rights are human rights. The fact that we differentiate the two is wrong, because I think that the Afghan men have suffered just as much as the Afghan women have.
Thank you, Mariam. In fact, that brings a host of other questions, but let me let you rest for a couple of minutes. And I will move to my traditional victim, Ivan Safranchuk. Ivan, Russia and India have for long been sort of together in their approach to Afghanistan. If you recall, Iran, Russia, and India were the ones who were backing Ahmed Shah Massoud. But over the past 3 years, there has been what I would describe as daylight creeping into the views of India and Russia. There is a distance that is growing. And that distance is growing primarily because I think the Indians perceive that a certain element of great power rivalry has entered into Russia's decision making on Afghanistan. Uh, before, so I would like you to address this question first. And of course, the next one is, and directly linking to the report that has appeared in uh, the US press, as to why. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying, I know the official Russians have denied that report, have described it as false, but it's not, the question is not that I have in mind. The question I have is, why is it that there is such a timing of such reports at this point of time? Is it purely because of internal US politics, or is it something that is linked with Afghanistan also? And of course, linked to that question is, can we completely dismiss that report as false? The floor is yours, Ivan, with both these questions.
Thank you, Nandan, and thank you for inviting me. While you were asking my question, I was getting concerned that I need to be accountable for the Russian government. But in the end of your question, I got really scared, because now I understand I need to be accountable for the American government, which is, or even worse, for the American politics, I need to be accountable. Seriously speaking, I think that in the last 10 years, Russia has been increasing its independent knowledge on Afghanistan. Because in the previous decade, after 9/11, through most of 2000 years, Russia was very much relying on the United States to make things right in Afghanistan. And Russia was supporting the United States in various ways. But when Obama came and actually made clear that at some point America may just drop Afghanistan, drop and withdraw, and say that everything is good, now we leave it to you. To whom? To you. To neighbors of Afghanistan, to Afghans themselves. And maybe you remember that exactly 10 years ago, Russia started talking more to regional powers about Afghanistan. And Russia, I think, had to some extent, competing narratives in its talks to regional powers. One narrative was, what if America entrenches in Afghanistan and poses a threat from Afghanistan to regional powers, to China, to Iran, to Pakistan? India was not concerned with that, but of course Russia, China, Iran, and even Pakistan were concerned. That was one narrative Russia was sort of discussing with the regional powers. But the other narrative, a sort of alternative, competing narrative, was, what if America drops Afghanistan and withdraws? Then we, regional countries, neighbors, immediate and extended neighbors of Afghanistan, need to do something. And we need to talk about it. I think that after huge deterioration, after severe deterioration of U.S.-Russia relations in the aftermath of the Ukrainian crisis after 2014, Russia started, I would say, reestablishing its leverages in the region. In Afghanistan as well, but also broader in the region. If Russia needs to do something independently, what capabilities Russia would then have, on whom it would need to rely? But I do not interpret all that as great power competition. And I want to say exactly that I do not see, neither in the 2000 years, nor in 2010s, nor now, I do not see great power competition in Afghanistan. I do not see anything comparable to what it was in Vietnam in the 60s. I don't see anything comparable to what it was in Afghanistan itself in the 80s, when a big proxy war was fought against the Soviet Union. I see some elements of proxy wars. For example, we all know about a proxy war between India and Pakistan on the Afghan soil, with actually thousands, if not hundreds, of people being killed in that war. What is interesting is that India says it is not participating in such a war. Pakistan says that it is not participating in such a war, but you accuse each other in participating in such a war. We see some elements of proxy war between Iran and some other countries in Afghanistan. But I do not see any signs of a proxy war between the United States and Russia in Afghanistan. So for me, the situation for now is that the Russian policy is concerned, what if Russia would need to do something without the United States in Afghanistan, if the United States drops it? But I do not see a strong element of doing something against the United States in Afghanistan. And I think that is a very substantial difference, to do something without and to do something against. I think a big element in the Russian policy, in the Russian foreign policy exists, and not only with regard to Afghanistan, but also with regard to Syria, Middle East, and other in other parts of the world. And that is the element of doing something without the United States, maybe even in opposition to the United States. But that is very substantially different with doing something against the United States and fighting a proxy war against the United States. Within this logic, I have, for now, the report of New York Times does not fit. Um, I can imagine that this is an echo of something going on, but being substantially different from what we see with what we hear with this echo. But I would say there is no great power competition in Afghanistan. I think the problem in Afghanistan is very much internal. That is an issue about struggle for power, mostly for Kabul power. That is a struggle for the political system and how it is to be organized. And we see that actually Afghans themselves are very much attract foreigners for various reasons, political reasons, economic reasons, and so on. And I think that that can be confused with great power competition, but that is not great power competition.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you so much. And you stuck to your 7 minutes. So I'm very impressed with that. And now my question moves to our next panelist, who is an unusual person. He is the first non-UK citizen to advise a UK minister, was an advisor. He's also advised the Conservative Party, again as a non-UK citizen. He has been deployed in Afghanistan for more than a year and has earned the Bronze Star. So he's got a lot of experience on the ground as well as a national security apparatus official. So it would be interesting to hear his views on the subject. I will specifically, of course, ask two questions. One is purely as an Indian. I appreciate what was written in the New York Times, and I understand that you will go after the Russians and you would want them to respond to these charges. But why is it you let Pakistan off the hook? I mean, we all know what is happening there, and we all know what their game is. Why are you letting them off the hook? That is my first question, as an aside, as purely as an Indian. But at a more serious level, I mean, if we are talking about great power rivalry, clearly, just as much as the Afghan people are tired of the war, the US is also losing its capacity and interest to continue staying in Afghanistan and is looking for an honorable exit out of the situation there. And while that is understandable, and we all know why the United States went in, what are the guarantees the United States is getting that its interests will not be harmed by whatever evolves in Afghanistan? And the second is, uh, what what are the mechanisms it's going to try and keep in place once it exists to ensure good behavior on behalf of all participants in the new setup in Afghanistan? Floor is yours, Luke.
Thank you. And I want to firstly thank the ORF and also Her Afghanistan Foundation for hosting this event today and inviting me to speak. On your first question, I think the U.S. views of the role of Pakistan and Afghanistan were continuously evolving over the earlier years of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, from a point of where in the earlier days of the mission, soon after 9/11, with the Bush administration, I believe there was a thinking that if we could put enough pressure on Pakistan, or threaten enough pressure, that they would come around and help us fight Al Qaeda and the Taliban. That was very naive. We now know. Of course, hindsight is 2020. Going into the Obama administration with Pakistan, I think there was a reluctance to even acknowledge that that Pakistan was a major cause of the problems we have in Afghanistan. In fact,
Luke, you've disappeared. Hello? Hello? Luke? Oops, I think we have lost him for the moment. So let me wait for Luke to rejoin us. In the meantime, uh,
Hey,
okay, you're back. You're
sorry,
back.
yeah, sorry, I
Yeah.
don't know what happened.
Okay.
Happened there. I apologize. I wasn't trying to escape your question or anything. I
No,
don't know
not
where
at
I
all.
cut off, but I'll say under the Obama administration, I think there started out with this naivety that they could solve the Afghan problem without Pakistan. I remember being in Kabul around 2009, 2010, where I heard a very senior U.S. commander say that they can get around the Pakistan problem by sort of sealing it off and just focusing on the domestic challenges in Afghanistan. And when I heard that at the time, I thought that was incredibly naive. And it wasn't until I think with the Trump administration that real pressure has been applied to Pakistan with scope of doing more. Clearly, Pakistan is a cause of a lot of the instability, especially in the border regions. And there are certain entities inside Pakistan that benefit from continued violence and continued fighting. So, without a doubt, the U.S. has taken a long time to finally get to this point, and perhaps it is too little, too late. On your second question about um, the continued war and the desire by the American public to leave Afghanistan. And of course, President Trump in 2016 campaigned on this issue, ending the forever wars. I found this a very interesting angle to take politically. In 2016, no one in America was really thinking about Afghanistan. Um, the U.S. was not leading major combat operations. Thank God, few American body bags were coming back to the United States. The amount of money the U.S. was spending in Afghanistan was far less from the peak of 2010, 2011. And then all of a sudden, it was decided by the main candidates in 2016 to make it an issue. You know, I served in Afghanistan in 2005, which now sounds like ancient Afghan history. And I remember coming back home to America after my tour and sitting in a baseball stadium thinking, you know, wow, the US Army is at war. America is not at war. When I was looking around, there was no feeling of the country being at war. So I don't think there is a fatigue in America. Unless our political leaders mention the war in Afghanistan, I don't think your average American gives any thought to it. And that's both good and bad, I want to stress. So I don't believe I think there is a politically induced fatigue. And President Trump has made the very bold effort to pursue a negotiated settlement to try to end the fighting in Afghanistan. I think this was the right approach. I wish this approach would have been taken even before President Trump. But nevertheless, he was the first president that was willing to do this. And I think when you look at the number one goal for the United States in the initial talks with the Taliban was to get the Taliban to talk to the Afghan people, to the Afghan government. The goal was the intra-Afghan talks. The number one goal for the Taliban was to get foreign forces out of Afghanistan. So these two were competing against one another. And finally, they had a breakthrough few months ago when it was announced that all foreign forces will be out by next April of 2021. And then the Taliban will sit down with the Afghan government and have intra-Afghan talks. So far, this has been 2 steps forward and 1 step back. There's still a need for more progress. There needs to be more confidence building between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And as was already mentioned, there are plenty of spoilers out there. The horrific attack a few weeks ago by the so-called Islamic State of Khorasan that targeted a funeral ceremony in Jalalabad and a maternity ward in Kabul was, of course, condemned by the Taliban and claimed by ISIS. But the Taliban should not be so easily left off the hook because they at least established in part the conditions that have allowed groups like ISIS to establish themselves and to operate. So you asked what, how the U.S. will make sure that its interests are being met in Afghanistan and that all sides are living up to the agreement. This is going to be very difficult to do. In the agreement with the Taliban, there was a reference to certifying that the Taliban is actually denouncing terrorism, but they didn't explain how this would be done. There are some proposals about international observers playing a role, but no one has stepped up to the plate, and there's been no additional detail on this. So I think U.S. planners are still trying to figure out how this is going to be the case. But right now, the number one goal for the United States should be to encourage and get all Afghans around the table, the Afghan government, the Afghan people, the Taliban, to try to come up with a negotiated settlement amongst themselves that can be an enduring peace for the country. I'll conclude by answer on this question by saying that it is in America's interest that we continue to play a role in Afghanistan, even after there's an agreement between the Afghan government and the Taliban. We need to continue with our financial assistance. We need to try to find a way to continue training the Afghan, the ANDSF, the Afghan Defense and Security Forces, even if it's in a third country, a regional country. The U.S. needs to try to play a role to do this. The ANDSF is Afghanistan's ticket to long-term stability and security. And finally, we need to continue funding the Afghan defense forces. In 2010, 2011, the United States was spending $120 billion a year on combat operations in Afghanistan. And right now we're spending about $4.5 billion a year funding the Afghan Defense and Security Forces. This is a bargain for the US taxpayer. This is what $4.5 billion is what we were spending every 13 days in 2011 and 2010 and 2011. So America needs to continue with that financial commitment and that political commitment to Afghanistan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I must apologize. I forgot to formally introduce you. So Luke Coffey is the director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. And now, with great pleasure, I move to our next participant, Mr. Rakesh Sood, who is a former distinguished Indian diplomat, has been our ambassador in Afghanistan, but of course in India he is better known as the father of India's disarmament, nuclear disarmament program. He set up that division in the Ministry of External Affairs. Mr. Sood, we've heard all these remarks from the other panelists. And to me, it seems that everyone is unhappy with the agreements that have emerged. Obviously, I can understand the United States knew when it went into negotiation that it was not going to get 100%. But everyone else also seems to be unhappy. Now, how does India, which is not yet a great power, but does have certain interests in Afghanistan, how does India view the current situation there, A? And the second question is something that, I assume you will respond to it, but something interesting that Ivan had mentioned about the proxy war between India and Pakistan on Afghan soil. That is something that I would like you, as a former ambassador, particularly, to enlighten us about. Mr. Sood, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nandan, and thank you for putting me in such great company. I think we heard some superb interventions. One thing that struck me, which is interesting, is that I think, as you also accurately summed it up, that everybody seems to be somewhat unhappy because we call it a peace deal. I mean, the 29th February agreement between the US and the Taliban that was signed in Doha. Newspapers, media, mostly it is labeled as a peace deal. But the fact is that it is actually a US withdrawal deal. And we don't use that term very often. Maybe it's uncomfortable, but In reality, that's what it is, because out of the 4 parts of that deal, the ceasefire, we know there is no ceasefire. In fact, Afghan authorities have been on record to say that violence levels have continuously risen. We've seen some pretty ghastly attacks. Mariam referred to it, as did Luke. Intra-Afghan dialogue, well, hasn't started. It was supposed to have started on 10th of March. So hopefully, President Ashraf Ghani said recently that he hopes that it might begin by middle of July. I believe Ambassador Khalilzad is again going to be in Doha and in Islamabad trying to move things forward in the first week of July. So then you are left with the 2 other points. You're left with US withdrawal, and you are left with Taliban assurances regarding their cutting ties with all international terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda and so on. Now, US withdrawal, I mean, I'm told that General McKenzie had said that they are on track to come down to 8,600, or they are already at that figure. There was a recent report on CNN saying that President Trump is looking at reducing it further by another 4,000. So yes, it is condition-based, but the condition is the US election and not conditions in Afghanistan. When it comes to Taliban's linkages with Al-Qaeda, I think we saw a recent UN report that you referred to by a sanctions monitoring committee, which said that there has been absolutely no reduction in the kind of high-level contacts that have continued to take place between senior Taliban leaders and senior Al-Qaeda functionaries. And any thought that this is diminished in any way is pure fiction. That's exactly what the report says. So I think let's call it a US withdrawal deal. Now, if you say that, okay, if it is a US withdrawal deal, it is fine. I mean, the US is a sovereign state and has a right to take decisions as it deems in its own interest. But then I think the challenge here is that in Afghanistan, there is, let me put it like this, there is 100% constituency for peace. Everybody in Afghanistan wants peace. And I think that's, Mariam also mentioned that. The problem is on whose terms? And on that, there are varying opinions. Now, because of internal disagreements within Afghanistan, we've now seen some kind of a rapprochement between Dr. Abdullah and President Ashraf Ghani in terms of how they will divide their responsibilities. So at least now, perhaps there will be more of an attempt at developing some kind of a unified position. We hope that from within Afghanistan, we will see a more unified position that will emerge in the intra-Afghan dialogue. And as far as you asked me about the Indian position, I think we had in 2011, we first said that we support an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, Afghan-controlled peace process. And we have stuck to that. Now, unfortunately, that meant that we were sort of one step behind the Afghan government, as it were. But if the Afghan system itself, if the Afghan government, the national unity government that existed, was not united and didn't have a coordinated position, then obviously we were somewhat out of the loop. We were somewhat on the margins. Our friends in Afghanistan who have repeatedly told us that they would like us to be more engaged with the political process, not because there is great clarity as to where it is going. We don't know that. In fact, nobody knows that. Nobody really knows how the intra-Afghan dialogue will evolve. But since we've been a major development partner for Afghanistan and enjoy a degree of affection, regard, respect from our Afghan friends, cutting across ethnicities and cutting across political parties, I think it is natural that they would like us to be engaged with the difficulties that they're going through. Now, we have, I think, taken a somewhat a kind of a backseat on this. And perhaps that is why we've not done our own outreach to the different players. Perhaps we should, and the time has come that our government should think about it, and we should take that. Coming to the question that Ivan posed about India-Pakistan proxy wars, frankly, I see no proxy wars between India and Pakistan. The problem is, now Pakistan is locked in a hostile relationship with India since 1947. That's a historical fact. I mean, we've had wars with Pakistan. We continue to have firings across the line of control even now. There are incidents of terrorism and so on and so on. I need hardly point that out. But the fact is that we are locked in a hostile relationship with Pakistan. Now, if Pakistan chooses to see its relationship with Afghanistan through the prism of its India prism, through the India lens, then I'm afraid it will always be locked in a hostile relationship with Afghanistan as well. And it will look upon Afghanistan as a territory for India-Pakistan, jostling for influence. We don't look at it like that. And certainly the Afghans don't look at it like that. The Afghans feel, and recently, just less than a week ago, I was listening to an interview by President Ashraf Ghani, where he said categorically that India has and will continue to have a very important role in Afghanistan's development. So there is no, and Afghanistan doesn't want Pakistan to have a veto on its relationship with India. I don't think Afghans are ever going to allow that. And so I think it is a problem of Pakistan's own making that it sees Afghanistan as an area where it has to engage in a rivalrous relationship with India.
Thank you, Mr. Sood. Thank you very much. I have now a set of questions that have been asked in the question box, as well as some have come up in our chat. I'll start with Mariam. I can see that Mariam has answered one to Mr. Goel, but it's a question that I would like the entire audience to be able to also hear your answer. And the question that was asked by, I presume this is Ambassador Suresh Goel, was when Mariam referred to Mullah Amar supporting or initially thinking in terms of propping Zahir Shah as the head, what was the evidence that she has for that statement? That is point one. The second question is something else that cropped up primarily from what Luke had said and Ambassador Sood. Even I think it is a misnomer to think that there are two sides in the intra-Afghan talks. That there is one side is Taliban, and then there is this monolith which is represented by the Afghan government. Because to the best of my understanding, even that is a divided lot. Within that you have people who are not very comfortable with Ashraf Ghani, people who have other interests, do not necessarily think that he is the best person to conduct these talks, although he has won the election and he is the rightful representative in that sense. So what is the state of play in the politics within those who are today associated with the Afghan government? That is my second question to Mariam.
Sorry, I was just writing it down. I wanted to take a step back, and since we're talking about great powers and it's kind of focused on Russia, I wanted to place a bit of information out there. So I think that we've been very clear that Russia is now bent on cultivating its own patronage network in Afghanistan, and it's mainly to gain advantage over the United States and China. We forget this power as well, with a golden opportunity to basically reposition itself in Central Asia. Russia's security concerns in the region are from drug trade, human trafficking, illegal migration, and above all, the most important, which is terrorism, that we all keep reflecting on. which they all point towards that is stemmed from Afghanistan. Now, I remember just a few minutes ago, Yvonne mentioned the New York Times article were outstandingly slender, but Russia maintains close links with the Taliban. And it's deeply concerned about the rise of Islamic State. And I think that they use Taliban as one of the potential bulwark against this. Now, Moscow has been accused to support the Taliban with arms and money. I remember Putin's special envoy to Afghanistan was openly touting contacts with the Taliban. In his article in his interview with Interfax in December 2015, that Moscow's interest in Afghanistan objectively coincides with those of the Taliban in fighting the ultra-radical Islamic State. And there were also reports that Russian officials claimed Moscow was sharing intelligence and exchange information with the Taliban against IS. Now let's look at another component. Russia has spread its influence in the region through a grip of international institutions such as the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and these organizations enabled Russia to integrate within Central Asia on the states of economic, political, and social levels, but opened a huge door to elevate its security coordination. These organizations recently work together to counter the threats from Afghanistan. I believe this March, representatives of the border agencies of Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan met in Samarkand to devise a plan to prevent infiltration by militants in Afghanistan. So let's keep in mind that Russia holds a near monopoly over the arms and trade in the region. I know that Uzbekistan has concluded various contracts to purchase advanced military equipment from Russia. Kazakhstan, Russia is actively taking measures to modernize their air assets. And in the same vein, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan are militarily intertwined with Russia. Now, unless the Americans leave suddenly and develop an aid vacuum in Afghanistan, the impact of deteriorating US-Russian relation will not be felt as strongly on the grounds by the Afghans. But it's really important for Afghanistan to improve its own relations with Central Asian neighbors, particularly with Tajikistan, and that is only with the nod from Russia. It's extremely important, and that's the best way for us to hold better regional connectivity. Now, when we were speaking about the slots within the intra-Afghan negotiation, as I mentioned earlier, that it looks like they're strong political individuals that are supposed to represent the Afghan public. The Afghan public is fractured. And before the Afghan government was fractured, but recently this new agreement between Abdullah and President Ghani actually works in the benefits to both of their strengths. President Ghani is going to focus on institution building, where Abdullah is going to focus more on bringing the nation together to speak regarding the intra-Afghan negotiation, and he is known for his communication skills. The political divide is going to be there, and it's not only within Afghanistan, I think it's in all regional countries, but Yvonne mentioned that Afghans are reaching out to the international community to bring the international community into their internal political game. That may be true, but I must tell you, your international community is also not innocent here. They are actively looking at a place where they can position themselves on where they're going to make their next move. We can't forget that we are in this position because the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and no international power is an innocent player here. And I'm quite emotional about this because we have lost so many lives. People are referring to genocides that are taking place in other countries when there's 200, 300 people dying a year. But in Afghanistan, we have about 400 to 500 people dying a day. So I'm quite emotional. And I think that we as experts in specific fields should hold not only the Afghan people and the Afghan government accountable, but we need to definitely hold international countries, including your own respective nations, accountable. That we need to, if anything that this pandemic has shown all of us is that we should be extra careful on how we are moving forward and be a bit more humane in the process. Now, to the question about Cesar Shah, I had responded to it, and I know that I'm going over my 7 minutes here. So you guys can read it in the questions. I've referred to a few books that have mentioned it, and then the gentleman asked, Ambassador Goyle asked, then why was Hamid Karzai selected? I can't state that because I wasn't a part of the Bonn conference. But Zahir Shah was a candidate that they were going to bring back, and we have to also remember that the Taliban were excluded from the Bonn conference because United States was in revenge mode. I mean, it was the Patriot Act that took place, and unfortunately, the Taliban had housed Osama bin Laden. But now they're in negotiation. So emotions play a key role in all political positions. So back then, if in the Bonn conference, if the Bush administration had invited the Taliban, maybe it would be in a different place. So right now, too, I know that we are all speaking in a very soft manner, but emotions play a huge part in how our countries move forward.
Thank you, Mariam. I think that passionate intervention was required. It was necessary to put a perspective on the entire problem we are discussing, because it is not just purely some kind of abstract intellectual problem. It is a human tragedy, and that should stand at the fore. So I cannot but agree with what you said. Uh, you've also done me another favor. I was going to ask all panelists not to feel shy to ask each other questions, and you have proceeded down that line. So I will hand this over, the question that you raised about Russia's role, what Russia could possibly think in terms of developing in its relationship with Afghanistan, because Russia has several reasons to worry: drug trafficking, terrorism, stability in Central Asia itself. So, how does Russia perceive the idea of pursuing these interests? Ivan.
I do not think that Russia has active interests in Afghanistan, meaning that I do not know that Russia wants to get anything from Afghanistan. Russia does not want any minerals from Afghanistan. Russia does not want geopolitical influence in Afghanistan. Russia, I don't know what else can be. I don't see any practical, pragmatic, or ideological things Russia would like to get from Afghanistan. I think the only interest Russia has is not to have Afghanistan as a problem, as a big regional problem. Whatever kind of the problem, whether it's a problem that somebody from Afghanistan attacks the United States, or whether it is a problem that somebody from Afghanistan plans terroristic acts in Europe or in Central Asia or in the Northern Caucasus and so on. And Russia has reasons to be concerned with that, because maybe you do not remember, and some people are now very soft on the Taliban, but let us not forget that actually the Taliban established diplomatic relations with de facto independent Ichkeria in 98. And that time, at the turn of the 20th and 21st centuries, a lot of terroristic issues in Central Asia, in the Russian Northern Caucasus, even in the Volga region and so on, a lot of those terroristic issues seemed to be connected to Afghanistan. And that's why Russia sincerely supported the United States invading Afghanistan and trying to make things right in that country. So the only interest I see in Russia is the interest for Afghanistan not to be a problem. And I understand that the best solution to that is that there is such organization of political power in Afghanistan that internal grievances do not internationalize. They do not attract foreigners, and they are not exposed on foreigners. And that's why inter-Afghan political settlement is needed. Who is to achieve it? These are Afghans themselves. I do not share the idea that international community or our respective countries are in any way responsible or accountable for what is going on in Afghanistan right now. Cold War is over 30 years ago. There were countries who suffered a lot during the Cold War. Take Vietnam, take some other countries. A lot of countries suffered during the Cold War, but they somehow found their way in the post-Cold War period. And I think that the Afghan nation will have to do that as well. Unfortunately, a lot of time is lost. A lot of time is lost on the civil war in the 90s, which has nothing to do with great powers. It has nothing to do with the United States or with Russia. A lot of time is wasted on some theories which existed in the 2000 years and 2010 years, theories that democracy can be very easily brought to Afghanistan and get wide support from inside a country. Then there was a theory that huge troops during the Obama administration can defeat the insurgency. This did not happen. Then the theory came that, oh no, on the contrary, if we withdraw troops, then the insurgency will go down automatically. This did not happen. I want to remind you a very simple statistics. Policies, American policies and NATO policies in Afghanistan changed substantially in the last 10 years. But in all previous 10 years, the level of security incidents in Afghanistan was above 20,000. 25,000 security, 20 plus thousand security incidents in Afghanistan in 2010, all years after that, with one exception, and last year as well. Whether you fight insurgency, whether you withdraw troops, whether you talk to Taliban or you do not talk to Taliban, with all that, you have 20 plus thousand security incidents in the country. So maybe something is wrong with the theories which were implemented, but not with the responsibility of great powers lasting from the Cold War.
Thank you, Ivan. There was an element of passion in your response too. I have an interesting, not an interesting, just a point to make. We are all discussing the Taliban, and we are discussing, talking about it being part of whatever future arrangement is and all. But I think we are all forgetting that Taliban is still proscribed by the United Nations as an organization. If I'm not mistaken, in Russia, it is still banned. It is a terrorist organization. How do we square this reality that we have a banned organization and yet we are negotiating with them? And what is it that is required from the international community for the United States, that is taking a lead in trying to bring peace to Afghanistan? Luke, what would you think required from the international community to support the United States in achieving this goal? And in particular, of course, what would you like the Russians to do?
Well, thank you for that. On the first question about pointing out that the Taliban has is prescribed by the UN, and in Russia you said it's designated as a terror group. I could be wrong, but I'm almost certain that in the United States the Taliban is not listed as a foreign terrorist organization, and I think that was done probably by design. Recognizing that the nature of the conflict in Afghanistan was more of a counterinsurgency operation led by the US and the Afghans against an insurgency predominantly led by the Taliban, an insurgency that used terrorist tactics. So the goal of any counterinsurgency campaign is to get those people who have political grievances the ability to address these grievances through a political process and not through violence. You can no more kill your way out of an insurgency than you can drink yourself out of alcoholism. And I think finally, this administration realized that the U.S. foreign policy establishment realized that in order to have an enduring resolution to this conflict, there has to be some sort of negotiated settlement. Now, in my lifetime, there will always be some sort of insurgency in Afghanistan. In India, for example, there are counterinsurgency operations taking place yearly. Even the United Kingdom fought a counterinsurgency in Northern Ireland until the mid-90s. And just a couple of months ago, some Irish Republicans were caught trying to detonate a car bomb on a ferry going over to Scotland. And this just happened a couple of months ago. So I think that if the goal is to have all the violence reduced or stopped in Afghanistan, that's completely unrealistic. But we have to make every effort possible to get all sides together for a negotiated settlement. And I want to point out that this will be a process and not an event. We're not going to wake up one day and have all the sides agreeing to a robust and widespread ceasefire. It's going to take a very long time. We need to be patient. The international community needs to be patient, and we need to help all sides along the way find this solution where they can live together and work together and govern together in a way that's acceptable to all Afghans, not just Afghan government officials or the Taliban, but civil society, for minority groups. All Afghans have to be involved. And you did mention the fact that the Afghan government negotiating team is sort of divided, or the Afghan political establishment is sort of divided on this, and there's a divide with civil society and minority groups on what they want out of the negotiations. But I would also argue that the Taliban are divided as well, and that's why you see opportunities that ISIS is taking advantage of to bring disgruntled or disenchanted Taliban fighters or sympathizers over to their ranks because they see that a negotiated settlement between all Afghans only limits and harms the influence of groups like ISIS, for example. So they're taking advantage of recruiting disgruntled Taliban fighters into their ranks. In terms of what I want from Russia out of or in Afghanistan, I want to back up a little bit. And as an American, I'll be the first to admit and recognize that while we often see ourselves as being a solution for problems, sometimes by accident, we often end up being the problem itself. And no country's perfect. I can tell you as a former soldier, when I went to a place like Afghanistan, when my colleagues went to a place like Afghanistan, we were there to genuinely help the Afghan people. We thought we were there to help the Afghan people. We wanted to help the Afghan people. And most of the time we were helping the Afghan people. But sometimes countries can cause problems or get it worse. And I will admit that. The problem with what I heard was it doesn't sound like the Russians could acknowledge this. In the 90s, the civil war in Afghanistan was allowed to fester and allowed to continue on because the international community failed to get involved and failed to support the Afghan government. So the international community, I would say, is responsible for this. I do believe that Russia sees Afghanistan as a way to undermine U.S. interests. It was pointed out by Ivan that after the illegal these are my words, illegal annexation of Crimea, but after the intervention in Ukraine by Russia, that relations with Russia have gone downhill even more, and that Russia has looked at opportunities around the world, whether it's Syria, Libya, or in Afghanistan to undermine US interests, undermine the interests of America's partners, and make it that much more difficult for the United States to operate in a particular place. So more resources are focused trying to deal with a problem in, let's say, Afghanistan or Syria or Libya, and less US resources are focused on Eastern Europe and NATO and that region of the world. So I do believe that, you know, Russia is trying to play a spoiler role in Afghanistan. Who knows about the validity of the report in the New York Times, or why it was reported at this time, or what the motivations were. But all you have to do is look at what the GRU has been doing around the world, including using a nerve agent in England to try to assassinate a Russian dissident on British soil, to draw a logical conclusion that they could very well be doing similar things in a place like Afghanistan. I don't think that is a leap from reality to assume that. So I would like Russia to be more of a constructive partner, both publicly, and publicly they've said the right things for the most part. They've tried to facilitate help with the negotiations, but also behind the scenes they need to start acting more responsibly.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you very much. I must say, there was a little bit of whataboutery. I mean, you went off, I think, to other parts of the world, since it may be to highlight a particular aspect of Russian behavior. But, to be fair to the Russians, on many of the charges that you leveled, the jury is still out. You and I may be convinced about the validity of the charges, but the fact of the matter is that a publicly proven sort of case has yet to be built. But leaving that aside,
if I may just really fast, you cannot look at, this is a great power competition around the world. In the 21st century, we are experiencing great power competition. I often say, if you took a diplomat who was cryogenically frozen in 1880 and a diplomat who was cryogenically frozen in 1980, and you thawed both of them out today, it would be the one from 1880 that would most recognize the world we're in today, a multipolar world with different centers of power competing against each other for economic influence, diplomatic influence, military influence, trade influence. And that is the type of world we're in today. And you cannot talk about US-Russian big power competition without bringing in places like Syria, Libya, or Ukraine. These are all interconnected. They may be indirect connections, but they are all interconnected at the end of the day. And that's how Russia sees the problem. And that's how the United States should start seeing this problem as well.
I'm sorry, Nandan. I'm very sorry.
Yeah. One second. One second, Ivan. I'll give you the mic. Luke, I completely agree. I am not arguing that Russia's actions across the globe are not necessarily linked to what it perceives as its rivalry with the United States. Neither am I arguing the point that the United States does not perceive its relations with Russia as non-adversarial. In fact, your national security document calls it an adversarial relationship. So that is not the issue I'm getting into. What I'm trying to say is that we are here trying to discuss what is the possibility of the international community, particularly the great powers, getting together, finding convergence on what are the possible solutions where they can work together in Afghanistan. Making charges that one is a spoiler, I have no sort of nothing to argue with. But to say that they are a spoiler because they did something in the United Kingdom, to me, is a bit of whataboutery. Because then the response could be, oh, but the US is a spoiler because they did something, the CIA did something somewhere else. So I don't think, starting pointing fingers at things that are happening in other parts. But as a broad policy, if you're saying that Russia is trying to distract the United States in Syria, Libya, and other places, I would not have a significant difference of opinion. But again, now, before I go to Mr. Rakesh Sood, who has been dying to intervene in this discussion, I will very briefly give the floor to Ivan to say his peace. Ivan, in 2 minutes, please.
Actually, I didn't have much to say. I had a question. Unfortunately, oh no, you made very good and interesting comment, but unfortunately, you disconnect my question from what Luke said, because he was ending his intervention with saying that we are committed, that we are competing all around, we are fighting for influence, and so on. I said in my answer to the initial question, I do not see Russia competing with the United States in Afghanistan. But if Luke, you say that something, if you have the different opinion, then do you admit that the United States is actually in Afghanistan for any geopolitical purposes? You're competing for great influence there, for something geopolitical or economic reasons. So you are saying that there is great power competition for influence in Afghanistan. Is the United States and NATO competing for influence in Afghanistan? Or you think that, no, you are doing something very altruistic there, but Russia is competing there with you? I think the reality is very simple, that over 20 plus years, the United States and NATO are failing in Afghanistan. That's just the reality. That is very blunt reality. The level of insecurity continues to be on its peaks, over 20,000 security incidents per year. So you are failing. And I would say that many people in Russia are absolutely happy seeing the United States and NATO failing. That is true. I think that everyone who is talking to Russian experts and to Russian representatives may notice that Russia is actually comfortable with the United States and NATO failing. But to see somebody failing is not equal to competing.
Okay, thank you, Ivan. And now we are beginning to run a bit out of time. So before everything, I will give all the panelists 2 minutes in the end to say whatever they feel they have left unsaid. But in the meantime, my final approach before some of the other questions are brought out to Mr. Sood. There are some questions which I will also try and summarize, but I'm sure you've seen many of them. And they all revolve around the same question. Does India have to readjust its policies towards Afghanistan? Is it time for a major rethink, or does India continue on the same in the same vein? Let's say is the gist of many of the questions that are being asked in the chat box and in the question and answer space. Mr. Sood. You have to unmute yourself.
Thanks. Yes, I think we went into Afghanistan in 2001 after the Taliban. As you know, we didn't have an embassy after 1996. We had no relations with the Taliban. We went in after the Taliban went out in 2001, and we decided that we would contribute to on humanitarian assistance in terms of infrastructure building, and most important in terms of capacity building, because I remember President Karzai always used to say that the war in Afghanistan meant that an entire generation of Afghans had been lost. And so it was the most critical thing was to rebuild human resources in Afghanistan. As I said, in 2011, we said that we support an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, Afghan-controlled peace process. And that was it. However, we found that while many other countries were talking about it, in actual practice, they were not. I mean, let's face it. I mean, you see the agreement of 29th of February. It is, look at the title, it is between the United States and the Islamic Emirates, which is not recognized by the United States, etc., etc. I mean, you know, just see that. So it shows that, how complicated or how convoluted the thinking can be. That's why I say that it is a US withdrawal deal, and as simple as that. We should call it that, and no harm in that. I mean, at least we are not deluding ourselves. So now when it comes to the Indian position, we have a choice. We can say that we continue to believe. I mean, the fact is that, yes, most Afghans have come to accept that Taliban are a part of a political future of Afghanistan. I would say that that's why I said that 100% of the Afghans want peace. The only difference is, what are they prepared to pay for that peace? But they have come to accept. So if the price that is negotiated is acceptable, then Taliban will be part of the political future of Afghanistan. We can always say that when they are part of the political future of Afghanistan, we deal with them. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that we are invested in Afghanistan. We are the most preferred development partner. We have played an active role. We are a visible presence. And our friends in Afghanistan, whether in government or outside government, and international players, keep telling us that we should be more engaged. And we think we have a regional role. I mean, our government keeps saying that we have a regional role and so on. So from that point of view, I think it is being somewhat lazy to say that, all right, we will deal with when the Taliban become a political reality, when they are part of the administrative structures, and then of course we'll deal with them. But then everybody will. I mean, there is no two ways about it. So if you want to engage with them, that does not mean that we are engaging with, after all, the Taliban are not declared a terrorist organization in that sense. Yes, the number 2 person of the Taliban, Haqqani, has a $10 million bounty from the US, and he's a declared terrorist. So I don't know how the US will square that up, but that's for the US and their legal experts to figure out how they want to deal with the Taliban and the number 2. But be that as it may. So I think that from our point of view, it is therefore worthwhile to develop our own linkages with the Taliban, to find out, to get a better feeling of ground reality, to be engaged with our friends in Afghanistan, who, as I said, seem to be today convinced of the need for peace through negotiations, but don't have a unified stand in terms of how to go about it. So if they want somebody who they can rely on as someone who shares their vision of Afghanistan as an independent, sovereign, democratic country, which is exactly what we support, then I think it is worth our while, and we owe it to our Afghan friends to be engaged with them in this political process as well, and to provide our inputs. But that means that we would obviously have to make a certain amount of we have to undertake a certain amount of diplomatic outreach. To an extent, after all, we were present at Doha on 29th of February. Our ambassador was present at the signing agreement. We have attended meetings in Moscow and so on. Moscow, Russia is a friend of ours, US is a friend of ours. Both Ambassador Khalilzad and Ambassador Kabulov have publicly spoken about the need for greater Indian engagement. Our Afghan friends have publicly spoken about it. So I see no reason why, but if we don't have the diplomatic capital to invest in, then of course we can take a back seat. But then we shouldn't claim that, that we are being marginalized. Nor should we go into it because of the FOMO factor, the fear of missing out factor. Oh my God, there is a party happening, I'm not there, kind of thing. So that shouldn't be the FOMO. It should neither be the FOMO factor, nor should it be intellectual laziness, or but I think it should be the fact that yes, we are a major power in the region. We have a certain relationship with the Afghans, and therefore we owe it to them to remain engaged.
Thank you, Mr. Sood. I think you've summed up the dilemma before the Indians and, in fact, shown them the path ahead, I guess, if they're willing to carefully read between the lines. I will now come to the end part, and I promised everyone 2 minutes, all the panelists 2 minutes. All of you have read the questions, I think, in the chat box as well as in the question box. So I will do this in reverse order. I'll start with Luke, then move to Ivan, then to Mr. Sood, and finally, I will give the floor to Mariam to uh, say her final understanding of the discussions that have taken place here. So let us start with Luke. Luke, your 2 minutes now.
Thanks. I just want to end on a more optimistic note. So we often focus on the doom and gloom in Afghanistan, but we shouldn't forget what has been achieved in the last 19 years. And we should also not pretend that the Taliban is, in fact, on the front foot and that the US and NATO and Afghan forces are in retreat. On September 10th, 2001, the Taliban controlled 90% of the country. They controlled every major urban center, every major road network. And they have now been reduced to what is more of a localized insurgency operating in rural parts of the country. They have not captured a provincial capital and held it. They've captured a provincial capital only twice in the past 19 years and only held it for a few days at a time. And if you look at the conflicting reporting on areas that the Taliban control, the Afghan government says they control 22 districts. The Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. that follows open source reporting on Taliban control in Afghanistan, says the number is actually 74. Let's cut it down the middle and call it 48. Well, there are 421 districts in Afghanistan, so this means the Taliban controls about 11% of the districts in the country. So when will we be happy or satisfied? When it's 8% or 5%, or does it have to be 0? So let's not pretend that the Taliban are making huge security gains across the country. They are not, and we should be proud of what has been accomplished in Afghanistan, and also with advancing the rights of women and other minority groups. There's a lot more that needs to be done. It's going to be a long journey, but the U.S. and the international community should continue to work with the Afghan people to help them along the way.
Thank you, Luke. Now I get the floor to Ivan.
I think the core of the problem is that people do not know how to improve the situation in Afghanistan. It's not terrible now. The problem is that it is absolutely not sustainable. The Taliban does not control all Afghanistan, but the Taliban controls a substantial part of Afghanistan. 2 years ago, both the Afghan government and the US military stopped providing official statistics on area and population control. There was very good statistics on area and population control between 2014 or 15 and between 2018. Then this statistic was stopped. You can see that statistics in SIGAR reports, but then unfortunately SIGAR could not receive that data anymore. And usually we all know that if something is not transparent, then there is a problem. That's why people do not provide statistics. So the situation in Afghanistan is absolutely not sustainable. It's not terrible, but it's very tough, and it is sustainable. The problem is that the United States cannot improve the situation substantially, and if the United States withdraws, most probably the situation will deteriorate. And here we come to the core of the problem. The United States failed not because it was defeated, but because it was not able to achieve a sustainable solution, not able to achieve it over 20 years. And everyone understands that at this point, the United States cannot repeat what Obama did with the huge numbers of troops and aid and so on. That's why the problem is how to withdraw from something what cannot be better than it is now. And I think that that becomes a very important issue for the United States, because it is very much about the international standing of the United States. And exactly the question of the international standing of the United States is very much politicized now inside the United States. And that brings additional difficulties. So the best solution would be if all regional and great international powers help somehow the United States to save face and to withdraw from from Afghanistan. But it looks now that some regional powers and some great powers are not going to help the United States to save face for free. And it becomes very much the price in the international politics, what the United States will have to negotiate to allow regional and great powers to save the US face in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Ivan. Yeah, I would also tell the panelists that there are many questions. Maybe if you would share your emails, people could continue this conversation with you individually. Before I come to Mariam, Mr. Sood, any thoughts? 2 minutes.
Well, I see the point that Ivan is making about US having failed, and I think to an extent it is correct that the US has certainly failed in not just the US, I would say the international community. I think the US, when it went into Afghanistan, went in with the support of the international community, including Russia, including every country. And but yes, over a period of time, US policies and and the various reasons for it, US diversion to Iraq and all the rest of it and so on, as a long history. But yes, the net outcome is that the US has failed to provide a sustainable outcome in Afghanistan. And the situation is, I mean, the gains in Afghanistan were made in the first 5-6 years. After that, we have basically seen a steady decline, a deterioration of the security environment. Today, you have a situation where there are 35, 50 Afghan security forces being killed every single day. So, I mean, that's certainly not sustainable. But the tragedy is that the price for US failure, and that is why I feel sad in a sense that the US or the international community has failed, because the price for US failure is being paid by the Afghans. So I don't think anybody can feel happy about it in that sense. I mean, we can't feel, because I think that as a neighbor of Afghanistan, I certainly feel deeply unhappy that despite our efforts, despite the international commitment, despite all the efforts that we put in individually, etc., that Afghanistan is in this situation where it is the Afghans who are paying the price for it. And so, therefore, to that extent, I think it is important that is why we, in that sense, the Indian government's line that it should be an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned peace process is an absolutely valid position, and we should be able to help our Afghan friends. It is no longer a point of scoring, who is going to save face or not save face. I think that situation is, we are all grown-ups, we are all adults in the room, I would say. So we owe it to the Afghans to be able to let them take the lead and to be present to help in that process.
Thank you, Mr. Sood. I think that was a fair summing up and ending on a kind of a positive note. And with that, the floor is yours, Mariam.
And then you've placed so much pressure on me as I had to open and I had to close. First of all, I'd like to thank all the panelists. I think you guys are wonderful experts, and I really appreciated all your view. And Ambassador Sood, you're extremely respected amongst the Afghan community, and we miss you very much in Afghanistan. I wanted you to know that. I think that I need to reflect on United States not leaving Afghanistan is because again, I mentioned the emotional component. When the Soviets withdrew in Afghanistan, the international community left Afghanistan in bits and pieces. And then the civil war broke out, and the Afghan people suffered even more. So I think that there's an emotional responsibility that the United States and international community is upholding, and I really appreciate that. How they're going to responsibly withdraw, I'm watching very closely, and that is why I think I appreciate Observe Research Foundation and other experts who continuously discuss how we should withdraw in Afghanistan and how we need to continuously make sure that any of the responsible actors in the future in Afghanistan are held to a certain standard. I made a comment earlier, and I hope it's not ever taken out of context. I appreciate the fact that India did not communicate with the Taliban. We definitely understand that Taliban have a direct correlation with Pakistan. And the fact that India stood its ground not to communicate with the Taliban because they knew that Pakistan had a huge influence behind the Taliban. And I have there's great respect for it because India continues to stay true to its politics. And if they want to talk, they'll talk directly to Pakistan. They should talk directly to Pakistan regarding the Taliban. But now we have to look at the components of the Afghan Taliban. As Luke mentioned earlier, the Afghan Taliban are fractured. So you have the political leadership, you have the Quetta leadership, the Doha leadership, you have the Afghan commanders, and then you have the Afghan youth. And you know, the Afghan youth Taliban are the most important because they're the foot soldiers. And they're the ones that we need to communicate to. So thus far, we've had 2 ceasefires in Afghanistan. The first I was a part of in Kabul. And I saw the Afghan youth want to reintegrate into society. They were eager. They brought their cell phones. They were taking pictures with female journalists. They were opening doors for women who had groceries in their hand. They were playing music. They were eating cotton candy. They had a thirst to live life. They were exhausted of weapons. They wanted to use pens rather than holding a gun. So I think those are the people that we need to really communicate, because if there's no foot soldiers left for the leadership, then it will fail. Now, the Afghan Taliban hold a stronghold in the Afghan community. Why? Because again, I want to reflect that the Afghan people are very traditional conservative people. If you remember Amanullah Khan and others who tried to move forward in progress, it was only Kabul that was moving forward. Outside of Kabul, it held a lot of resistance. So what I would appreciate that moving forward is that we should look at our own governments and communicate responsibly with them on how we should move forward. The intra-Afghan negotiation is mandatory, but this is only the first phase. And maybe this is not going to be the only team. I think maybe that there should be multiple teams, multiple representations. I mean, from a gender perspective, I thought that it would have been phenomenal if it was just all women in specific fields, medical, Islamic scholars, mathematicians, engineers, to go sit down with the Afghan Taliban and discuss the important role that Afghan women have in rebuilding the nation. You have to understand that the war has killed many of the men of Afghanistan, and now it's not a patriarchal society as much anymore. It's a matriarch that's moving forward. So how can we help the structure and make sure that the women are a part of rebuilding our society? Security concerns are key. We need to make sure that our neighboring countries take responsibility to minimize terrorist threats, not only in Afghanistan, but in the region, and to continue to provide the support on advancing the Afghan youth. India has been a great partner in supporting Afghanistan when it comes to education. And I think that we need to continue this part, because the best way to win a war is to support the youth with actual intellectual information. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mariam. That was, I think, very neatly summed up. I think it's very clear that there is hope in Afghanistan. The Afghan people want peace. And it is clear that while great powers will continue to rival each other, they will continue to look for advantages. Afghanistan is one case where maybe, uh, I don't have much hope on that, but maybe they could bury their differences and try and do something together. And in that context of not having much hope, maybe civil societies in these countries, particularly in the great powers, if they could connect with the civil societies in Afghanistan, maybe there is a role that they could play in shaping the policies of their government. Thank you very much. Particularly, thank you to the audience. I have seen some very distinguished names there: Lieutenant General Arun Sahni, Ambassador Anil Vadva, and of course Suresh Goel, who participated. But I would like to once again thank Mariam, Ivan, Rakesh, Sood, and Luke Coffey for your participation and genuinely enlightening, as far as I am concerned, enlightening contributions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.